rise today with other colleagues that are speaking today, and particularly my colleague from Connecticut, Senator Murphy, to speak on a bill that actually passed out of the House, which was something that was extraordinary. It passed out of the House of Representatives just over a full year ago, that we're still waiting here in the Senate for it to come down to the floor. Now, I'm one of these folks that really believes that we have too much unnecessary partisanship around issues when there is so much common cause in our country, when there is so much common ground in our country. Yes, indeed, debate is important. Disagreement is important. It undergirds the ideals of a democracy, that we should form a national conversation and work through our differences. The idea that that actually produces a better whole, a better result. But when we have a nation that has such extensive agreement on an issue, where 97% of Americans agree, where Republicans and Democrats in the House of Representatives agree, and we can't get action here, to me, that is not adding to the strength of democracy, it's weakening our republic. It was almost exactly a year ago that the House of Representatives passed H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act of 2019. This legislation would require a background check before any sale or transfer of a firearm. Under existing law, you could go to a gun show and purchase a gun from an unlicensed seller without having gone through a background check. Think about this. You could be on a terrorist no-fly list. You could be a convicted felon. You can be a spousal abuser. You can be a lot of things, anything, and be able to go to an unlicensed seller at a gun show and fill up a trunk full of weapons. This is a glaring loophole that allows dangerous individuals that we all agree are dangerous to purchase a gun in violation of federal law. Now again, 97% of Americans want that loophole closed. And the evidence is clear. A study found last year found that states that have this common sense, widely supported, bipartisanly backed background check law, when they have it in place, if you're a state, you get 10% lower homicide rates. This isn't speculation. Folks that have that law in place on the state level, 10% less homicides. But today, over a year out of its passage out of the House, the Senate has failed to take up this common sense bill, which we know factually would save lives. What is one of the fundamental reasons why our government was founded in the first place? For the common defense. We are here to defend our nation from violence, from terror, from injury, from harm. Everyone in this body takes that commitment very seriously. And so here we have something 97% of Americans want. We know that it would save lives, protect our country, and yet no action. The bill has not come to the floor. I know this personally. I was the mayor of my state's largest city, and the overwhelming majority of homicides and shootings where we captured the person and found out how they got their gun, they were not qualified to buy a gun. It was illegal for them to buy a gun in any state because many of them had criminal convictions, yet they found easy ways to obtain a gun because we have so many loopholes in the common sense law. Loopholes that allow violence to happen that is terrorizing communities. And of course, we know that that is not just anecdotal evidence. According to the Gun Violence Archive, an estimated 15,208 people were killed with a gun in the United States in 2019. We know that gun violence is the single leading cause of death for children and teenagers. Our greatest natural resource as a country is our children. And for black children and teenagers, they're 14 times more likely to die of gun homicide than their white peers. It is a tragic carnage going on for African American kids. In just one day, for example, in St. Louis, Missouri, in just one city, St. Louis, Missouri, between April and September of last year, 13 children ranging in age from 2 to 16 were killed by a gun. And there's another kind of gun violence we don't talk about. We don't talk about enough the death of our children. We definitely don't talk about domestic violence in our country. It is factual. When an abuser can get a gun, a victim of domestic violence, if that abuser has a gun, a victim of domestic violence is 5 times more likely to be killed. And again, the racial disparities in communities of color like I live in, we know a black woman is twice as likely to be shot and killed by an intimate partner as well. Our duty is to protect this nation, is to protect one another. This is not controversial when you have 97%. 97%. And so every year in the United States of America, on average, 100,000 people are shot, and they survive, many of whom will carry with them for their lives mental and physical wounds. The economic costs of being a gun violence survivor is measured in the tens and tens of thousands of dollars. The community costs of folks being killed. I've seen this in my community when a shooting happened in front of the IHOP in Newark on Bergen Street. IHOP had to close one of its shifts. People lost jobs. It reverberates out into communities. These scars that are happening every day in America, these wounds, are physical, are economic, are mental health. I can't tell you how many communities in America, when we celebrate the very ideas of our country on July 4th, when those firecrackers go off, when children hear them, they duck for cover, they hide under beds, they show signs of post-traumatic stress. That's what we're living in right now. This is an everyday reality. And so I just came to the floor today to point it out. A year, 12 months, 365 days from the House passing a bipartisan bill supported by 97% of Americans that is fundamental to the reason for government, the common defense, in the wake of one of the greatest killers of children in our country, all of these things, and we here are doing nothing. What did Martin Luther King say? What we have to repent for is not just the vitriolic words and violent actions of the bad people, it's also the appalling silence and inaction of the good people. I have stood for comprehensive gun safety reform. And a lot of things I support aren't supported by 97% of Americans, like background checks. Heck, I support gun licensing. The percentage of Americans that support that falls into the 70s. I support an assault weapons ban. Support for that falls as well. So maybe that's an area where we debate. I will stand for those common sense changes because, again, I believe in the data. States that do that have seen dramatic drops in violence. But we can debate that. But when we have a bill from the House that 97% of Americans support, that has bipartisan support, that we know will save lives, and we don't act, what does that say about us? Every day in this country, people are being shot and people killed, and we do nothing when we all agree. This week, March 7th, will mark the 55th anniversary of the day that 600 civil rights activists led by a young man named John Lewis, set out to walk from Selma to Montgomery to protest systematic, racialized disenfranchisement, discrimination, and violence. Those nonviolent protesters were met with vicious beatings by billy clubs by Alabama state troopers. They had tear gas and dogs set on them. Congressman Lewis had his skull cracked open. By the next day, Americans all over this country, that horrific scene, we know this as Bloody Sunday, Americans all over this country who saw that violence, who saw that viciousness, saw what was done to people who were nonviolent marchers fighting for justice and equality. It motivated Americans of all backgrounds, black, white, Christian, Jewish, Republican, and Democrat, to join in the call for change. I love this nation and I love my country. I love folks who agree with me, who disagree with me. I think patriotism is love of country. And you can't love your country unless you love your fellow countrymen and women. Senate President, I love you, man. And we don't disagree. My friends across the aisle, heck, in our own caucus, we don't agree. But we love one another. And my faith and the other faiths represented in this body, I'm excited that we have more religious diversity in this body than ever before. All of our faiths are founded in this fundamental understanding: love thy neighbor. And this is the challenge. It is, how do we manifest love into our policy? Well, as one of the great authors I've read before, he says, what does love look like in public? It looks like justice. And this is the great thing about our country, is we don't always act right away, but throughout our history, when we were confronted with the wretchedness of our society, with the incongruencies between reality and our morals and beliefs, we have seen this country rise up and make change. When 4 girls died in a bombing in Birmingham, it shocked the consciousness of this country. We made change. When women in a factory called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, trapped in sweatshop-like conditions, fire breaks out, this country watched in horror, read about in horror back then, saw in horror through the pictures, women throwing themselves out windows, dying on the pavement below. It shocked the conscience of this country. And we, this body, we passed laws to protect workers. I could go throughout our entire history. We don't always are fast to get there, but we are a caring, compassionate, loving country. We are. That is the root of who we are. It's the values we profess. And I know, as much as we disagree and try to vilify each other, the truth is we are a nation founded in the ideals of love. Again, I look at my colleague up there in that seat, and I've watched him. I saw you on HBO reading our founding documents. It was moving to me to see Republicans and Democrats, I'm sure you saw it, reading our founding documents. Well, our Declaration of Independence, I hate to say this, you might say I'm a little too mushy, but it ends with one of the greatest declarations of love in human history. It says, if we are going to make this nation work, all the stuff we just talked about, if we're going to be the country that is, as the prophet Isaiah says, ultimately a light unto other nations, inspiring free peoples across the globe. We're the oldest constitutional democracy. We stepped out into the course of human events and said we're going to found a country based on virtue. Not a theocracy, not a monarchy, on virtue. That we would be a nation based on ideas, and those ideas, as imperfect as the geniuses are that founded this country, and God, they didn't believe that women were equal or blacks were equal, but they believed in those ideals and those virtues, and that this nation should always strive to make a more perfect union, making more real those virtues and those values in people's lives. And the history of our country is a glorious testimony to us getting it better and better each generation. Susan B. Anthony stood up and says it was we the people, not we the male citizens that made this country, not the white male citizens, we the people. She used the words of our founding documents to inform her moment of history, to call to the conscience of our country. Martin Luther King, right here in D.C., on the Mall. Does he turn to some new radical treatise? No, he goes back to our founding documents and quotes them in his speech at the March on Washington. That's the beauty of our nation. And so what does it say, that testimony to love at the founding of our nation, in the Declaration of Independence? And yes, to all those people, I will give you deference that declaration called Native Americans savages. I'll give you deference that the men who wrote it, they were imperfect representatives of the values to which they adhered to, or to which they, called to. But that declaration of love at the end is unmistakable. At the end of the Declaration of Independence, they say, if we are to make it all work, we must mutually pledge. I look at my colleague in the seat because he knows these words backwards and forwards. We must mutually pledge, that is, pledge to each other, our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. God, I think about those words more than you might realize. What does it mean to give someone your sacred honor? To pledge to them your lives and your fortunes. God, I would die for this country as I know my colleagues would. None of the people in this body, I know many of my friends in this body might have come here with great wealth, but none of them are doing it for wealth. Our lives, our fortunes, but that last one, sacred honor, what does that mean? It's, to me, words that evoke that greatest of human values, love, that word that we honor each other. We believe that we are people that must elevate each other and protect each other. And so there is a bill in the House that passed in a bipartisan way on that fundamental ideal of being there for one another. Whether you pray like me or look like me, we are there for one another. We protect each other. We stand for each other. I may have differences with the man in that seat who's on the other side of the aisle, but God, I give you my sacred honor. I'm not going to vilify or demonize your character because we are Americans. And now the call of our country, as people who are overlooked are dying every day in communities like mine around this country, people being felled by domestic abusers. We know from the data this can make a difference. Bipartisan voice, 97% of Americans. Can we pass comprehensive background checks? We can do better. Let's leave the things we want to debate, that God, I want to debate. Gun licensing, assault weapons ban, leave those aside, but we agree that someone on the terrorist no-fly list should not be able to go to a gun show and go to a casual seller and buy weapons. Those are the weapons showing up on the streets of Newark. We've traced them. My country, 'tis of thee. Sweet, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. May our country be free from fear and free from violence. And may we be empathetic towards those today that are fearful of their abuser, that are fearful to walk their kids to school. May we understand that that liberty to fight from freedom of fear still is an unachieved dream in this country. That liberty that comes from safety and security is still an unrealized dream for millions of Americans. And may we join together and pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. May we pledge to one another to do the work that America wants, to keep each other safe and secure, and to ensure our children, disproportionately impacted by violence, that our children grow up to carry on our culture and our traditions and the honor that is America.